ringraziandolo, e lui sa perché. Sì. Ecco, parola d'Angelo Calabresi.
Grazie al Presidente Rodotà, lo vedo Presidente. Lo ringrazio per il motivo della piccola allusione riside nel fatto che mi trovo a presiedere effettivamente la compagnia di San Paolo, della quale vi saluto e tanti auguri, che è fra i soggetti sostenitori di questa iniziativa.
Come
sostenitori? Sono dei sostenitori convinti, crediamo nella volontà dell'iniziativa per moltissime ragioni, per la volontà dell'insegnamento, della pratica con cui viene attuata, e anche perché, come dire, lo IUC mi pare che sia uno dei soggetti che stanno dando al sistema in generale, vi parlo del sistema nostro, un contributo importante in quella che io definisco, senza troppa originalità, devo dire, ibridazione delle culture. Naturalmente gli studi qua sono eminentemente allo IUC giuridici, ma giuridici anche con una forte componente di analisi economica. La presenza qua del professor Guido Calabresi non è affatto casuale, lo saluto con molto piacere. Sapete tutti benissimo che non è semplicemente un giurista, non è semplicemente un grande giudice, altra qualità molto rara, ma è anche un giurista che ha fatto grandi studi di analisi economica del diritto, e quindi in questo ecco che io parlavo di ibridazione delle culture. La nostra generazione, la mia si intende, non della vostra, è cresciuta a studi giuridici eminentemente formalistici. Noi siamo nati in un periodo di trionfo kelseniano, di positivismo, insomma, trionfante, per cui il formalismo giuridico la faceva da padrone. Ma nel frattempo intorno a noi, poi crescendo, il mondo è cambiato molto. Non solo diamo la globalizzazione, perché altrimenti entreremmo nell'ambito dei luoghi comuni che voglio risparmiarmi e risparmiarmi. Però è chiaro che la contiguità dei saperi ha fatto nascere molte cose. Voi sapete benissimo, per stare al concreto, che due sentenze molto importanti della Corte Costituzionale italiana, numero 348 e 349 del 2007, pare da Silvestri la prima relatore e Tesauro la seconda, hanno segnato una discontinuità molto forte, perché hanno trattato, entrambe queste sentenze, la rilevanza della Convenzione europea dei diritti dell'uomo, la CEDU, vis-à-vis dell'articolo 117 primo comma della Costituzione, così come modificato dalla recente riforma, per dire che la rilevanza delle regole della Convenzione europea dei diritti dell'uomo nel nostro ordinamento deve essere vista, percepita, interpretata e attuata come parametro di riferimento costituzionale, come prescrive il primo comma dell'articolo 117, così come interpretata dalla Corte di Strasburgo. Così come interpretata, che cosa vuol dire? Vuol dire due cose. Vuol dire secondo l'interpretazione data, vale a dire secondo i parametri pratici dati nel caso per caso, ma questo è naturale, è tipico di ogni precedente giurisprudenziale, che si applica a un caso e poi può essere applicato anche ad altri sulla base dei principi contenuti, ma soprattutto come metodo interpretativo, perché la Corte dei diritti dell'uomo non usa il metodo formalistico. La Corte di Strasburgo ha per esempio già dichiarato la contrarietà alle regole della Convenzione sui diritti dell'uomo nell'applicazione cieca delle clausole e delle regole di decadenza automatica e di decadenza assoluta. Se tu perdi un termine, il termine, come si dice, dura lex. Dura lex, che è sed lex, che è il parametro al quale siamo stati un po' educati noi da piccoli, non è un buon principio. Dura lex, se dura lex, la dura lex non va applicata, se la lex è troppo dura, secondo la Corte di Strasburgo. E questo cosa vuol dire? Vuol dire che il vivere delle norme, secondo la loro interpretazione, diventa un fatto principale rispetto al vivere delle norme sul piano soltanto della pura forma nella quale le norme vivono. Questo tipo di ragionamento, che è stato introdotto nel nostro ordinamento da queste due fondamentali sentenze della Corte Costituzionale, ci dice che anche noi dobbiamo cominciare a ragionare in modo diverso quando ragioniamo di cose del diritto e soprattutto quando cerchiamo di applicare queste cose del diritto. E quindi questo significa che, allontanandosi dal formalismo, dobbiamo catturare dalle culture che stanno accanto a noi altri parametri, altri modi, altri occhi di vedere il mondo che sono essenziali. Ecco perché è importante l'attività che svolge IUC, perché IUC è il contrario esatto del formalismo giuridico come tipo di insegnamento. Perché i richiami alle altre discipline, alle altre culture, specialmente quelle di matrice di common law, qui si richiama anche esplicitamente la Corte di Strasburgo nel riferimento che ho appena fatto molto rapidamente un momento fa, sono matrici culturali importanti perché danno a ciascuno di noi, danno a ciascuno di voi dei parametri di riferimento nei luoghi poi dove ciascuno è portato ad operare, che sono importantissimi perché cercano di accomunare, come dire, culture diverse all'insegna all'insegna del progresso dell'uomo, del progresso civile. Non è vero dura lex, come ho detto un momento fa. Dura lex, se la lex è dura vuol dire che da qualche parte c'è uno sbaglio e l'interprete lo deve correggere. Questo riferimento che vi ho fatto, non per annoiarvi, forse riuscendoci, ma perché semplicemente questo è uno dei modi con i quali noi alla Compagnia di San Paolo leggiamo l'importanza delle cose che voi state facendo, perché non si tratta soltanto di dispensare insegnamenti di natura tecnica o economica, ma di dare anche alcuni principi di riferimento che nel loro fondo sono largamente da noi condivisi e condivisibili. Spiega un po', da un lato il motivo per cui noi, ho detto prima, diamo un appoggio convinto, dall'altro il motivo per cui auguro tutti quanti voi buon lavoro con questa linea e grazie.
Ringrazio molto il Presidente Venessia. Vorrei riprendere per un secondo solo l'accenno iniziale e finale riguardo alla ibridazione di culture, alle presenze a Torino di studenti, vari paesi, e il dato significativo è rappresentato, abbiamo avuto ieri sera un consiglio di amministrazione, abbiamo registrato il numero di domande per il prossimo ciclo è raddoppiato rispetto al passato, 241 domande, 41 paesi di provenienza. Questo mi sembra un dato significativo che conferma un progressivo piccolo radicamento dello IUC in questo mondo complicato che abbiamo di fronte. Il rettore dell'Università di Torino è qui, lo ringrazio moltissimo, lo ringrazio per la presenza, lo ringrazio perché si sono poi via via stabiliti quei legami necessari tra le istituzioni di alta cultura, se ancora possiamo usare questa espressione di questa regione, di questa città, e dato che è stato così gentile di venire, chiediamo di dirci due parole. Sappiamo che è molto impegnato stamattina e quindi è un sacrificio in più. Grazie infinito.
Buongiorno a tutti, ci tenevo a salutare la IUC, l'anno accademico della IUC, e quindi ringrazio anche la Compagnia di San Paolo perché sostiene questi progetti internazionali e ovviamente adesso l'Università di Torino ha 6.000 studenti stranieri e quindi effettivamente è una situazione molto interessante dal punto di vista del ruolo di formazione per questi, diciamo, paesi. Credo che ovviamente perché secondo me l'università ha un ruolo molto importante e quindi della formazione dal punto di vista ovviamente della ricerca e effettivamente secondo me l'internazionalizzazione è un punto diciamo fondamentale. È fondamentale per il ruolo dell'università. Vi ringrazio e faccio un augurio e non posso sentire il professor Calabresi e quindi mi scuso perché oltretutto lui è un laureato honoris causa dell'Università di Torino e mi fa piacere ovviamente che sia a Torino per questa manifestazione. Grazie a tutti.
ringrazio molto il direttore Pellizetti. Devo dire che l'accenno all'internazionalizzazione delle istituzioni culturali oggi è una realtà e non sempre governata in modo adeguato, soprattutto nel nostro paese, quindi ho l'impressione che Torino sia da questo punto di vista anche un esempio su questo terreno, ed è la ragione per cui poi io vengo volentieri in questa occasione. Ho fatto cenno non solo alla città di Torino, ma alla regione Piemonte. Abbiamo qui Roberto Placido, che io ringrazio e che ci parlerà proprio a nome della regione Piemonte e che è altro dei soggetti istituzionali che danno il loro contributo importante alla vita dell'Unione. Grazie Roberto Placido.
Grazie, buongiorno a tutti. Grazie dell'invito. Quando mi arrivò, pensavo giovedì, giorno dedicato a cose generiche nella vita del Consiglio regionale, e in realtà mi scuso ma devo scappare ancora più velocemente del Lettori, perché pensavo di parlare a scappare via, mi giustificavo anche nel fare la stessa cosa, il Lettori, solo uno è anche autorizzato. Ma oggi c'è seduta di consiglio e quindi il consiglio presiedo io oggi, quindi devo sicuramente scappare. Sono alle prese con problemi legati alla caccia, che può sembrare marginale rispetto a cui stiamo parlando, di queste cose che vi voglio ringraziare, di problemi che sono alla base del vostro lavoro, economico, giuridico, finanziari a livello internazionale, che ci dà un respiro oltre i nostri confini, però c'è anche la caccia nella regione, quindi mi tocca andare assolutamente di là, però a parte così, anche trattando temi importanti, riuscire a farlo con un minimo di leggerezza, non basta, spesso troppi si prendono troppo sul serio, anche su cose che servono, magari non so. Io dicevo grazie a Dio, voglio ringraziare per il lavoro che fate, mi fa piacere che la Compagnia di San Paolo abbia dal primo momento, che continui a sostenere lo IUC, così come ha fatto e farà possibile perché la stessa regione più le altre realtà che sono state coinvolte, mi auguro che saranno coinvolte. Approfitto della presenza sempre del Lettore Pellizetti, perché una delle caratteristiche che ritengo positive del college è quella di non solo di rivolgersi e di coinvolgere, che aumentino, è estremamente importante, studenti che arrivano da altri paesi, cosa che le nostre università sono, come dire, ormai un dato consolidato in crescita, e questo è positivo, ma il coinvolgimento anche di docenti di altri paesi. La vera internazionalizzazione si raggiunge non solo con gli studenti ma anche con i docenti, e naturalmente in questo caso mi rivolgo al Presidente Benesia, una riflessione sull'attrattività del sistema è determinato molto dalla qualità di chi poi trasferisce il sapere. Gli stili di vita degli insegnanti un ruolo importante, spesso non sufficientemente riconosciuto nel nostro paese, viene svolto nelle elementari e nelle medie, dove oltre a sapere ai ragazzini si trasferisce anche i comportamenti, gli stili di vita, le regole, come poi funzionerà nel seguito. Quindi vedo veramente lo IUC come un grande esperimento importante, non solo per attrarre studenti, ma anche e soprattutto per attrarre docenti italiani e di altre nazioni. Questa è l'internazionalizzazione, e su questo versante che qualche riflessione mi leggevo a caso alla professora Benesia, perché la situazione dell'università italiana in questi tempi molto permette, ma non certo di fare investimenti attrattivi verso importanti e straordinari docenti di altri paesi, che invece penso siano delle cose importanti. Se noi vogliamo dare un ruolo importante, penso che Torino e Piemonte per questo non si possa fare, tutti gli insieme per rendere sempre più prestigiose le nostre idee. E l'esperimento dello IUC, permettete, dopo qualche anno non è neanche più un esperimento, è significativo, e qualche riflessione penso una giornata come questa importante vada fatto perché si possa ampliare, si possa fare dei ragionamenti. Poi non voglio sostituirmi assolutamente al ruolo del Presidente Rodotà, però ritengo che questo è una cosa importante lo IUC, importante che aumentino i numeri di studenti, importante ancora di più che ci siano moltissimi docenti di prestigio italiano, ma anche da altre nazioni, che trasferiscono i saperi, che trasferiscono una visione diversa, che trasferiscono conoscenze diverse, che si confrontano tra di loro, quindi studenti, docenti, e anche per quello che ho potuto, non è la prima volta, anche in momenti diversi da questo, vedere anche nel confronto fra le varie discipline contemporaneamente, la parte giuridica, la parte economica, la parte finanziaria. Questo permette veramente di avere un quadro importante in un momento come questo, senza voler usare la parola globalizzazione, ma è evidente che i problemi sono internazionali e conoscerli, confrontarli, poterli approfondire dai vari versanti è un lavoro straordinario. Complimenti, buon lavoro a tutti quanti. Mi auguro che la prossima volta non ci sia un ordinato consiglio fuori giorno canonico, che è il martedì, perché avrei con grande piacere ascoltato non solo il professor Calabresi ma anche gli altri, cercando di sfatare una delle cose quasi che non si possono modificare della politica, nel senso dei politici che parlano non sempre bene ma ascoltano poco. Oggi avrei cercato di sfatare questo luogo comune, che è vero, sarei rimasto volentieri ad ascoltare, perché non si finisce mai di imparare. Per poter fare le cose bisogna ascoltare, possibilmente quelli che hanno qualcosa da dire. A questo tavolo, a parte il sottoscritto, ce ne sono molti. Grazie e buona giornata.
Pagina ha fatto giustamente riferimento non solo all'internazionalizzazione degli studenti ma dei docenti. Credo che noi possiamo essere abbastanza fieri di una vicenda, quella che ha consentito, cattedra non è il professor Lettori, grandi studiosi di questi temi, e quindi c'è questo versante che questo è un piccolo successo, diciamo, dello IUC, su due versanti, riconosciuto internazionalmente, meritevole di avere dei professori di grande rilievo. Roberto Placido, con la sua presenza, voglio dire, introduce inconsapevolmente il tema dei beni, di cui si occuperà adesso Guido Calabresi, perché lo voglio dire, non è il promotore di una legge approvata all'unanimità dal Consiglio regionale del Piemonte, la prima legge regionale in Italia in questa materia, diciamo la prima legge perché non ci sono leggi nazionali, sull'accesso a Internet. Il tema dell'accesso a Internet addirittura come diritto fondamentale della persona è in questo momento un tema che attraversa il mondo. Costituzione è di 2 settimane fa il fatto che il Perù ha approvato una legge che riconosce il diritto fondamentale della persona all'accesso a Internet. Quindi, come dire, è anche un buon augurio che questo gioco intrecciato tra la riflessione scientifica, la riflessione politica e una sua traduzione molto difficile. Io so, ho enormi difficoltà di tradurlo sul terreno legislativo, è però uno dei segnali anche dell'utilità del lavoro che facciamo. Io vedo che il rettore e il presidente devono scappare, il ringraziamento in particolare a tutti voi. Grazie. Adesso è il momento centrale di questa mattinata. I ringraziamenti a Guido Calabresi sono veramente infiniti, non finiscono mai, li ripeto con grande amicizia, se posso aggiungere anche con con grande affetto, e quindi è veramente un onore che questa mattinata sia affidata al suo pensiero. Grazie Guido.
Innanzitutto in italiano voglio ringraziare e dire che piacere è per me essere qui. Voglio ringraziare la compagnia, la regione, l'università, perché per 10 anni all'incirca feci il preside della facoltà di giurisprudenza a Iero e quindi mendicante universale, persona che sapeva bene l'importanza di aiuti, di sostegni come quello dato all'aiuto dalla compagnia. Senza questo non si poteva fare niente, non si può fare niente, e quindi proprio con la mia esperienza dico un ringraziamento di cuore, ma anche poi rapporti con la regione e con l'università, perché anche da noi quello che noi cercavamo di fare in giurisprudenza, un po' diverso da tutti gli altri, doveva avere rapporti, controlli, discussioni col resto dell'università e con lo Stato. Quindi il fatto che questi erano qui, sono qui e aiutano, è una cosa fondamentale cui voglio sottolineare. Poi voglio dire la mia gioia e piacere ad essere qui per la IUC, perché questo è un posto dove davvero si sta facendo lavoro di diritto e di economia a un livello di idee aperte, del nuovo, dell'interessante e dell'internazionale. Quando vengo qui a fare lezioni e vedo ragazzi e ragazze da tutte le parti del mondo che hanno di comune la cosa più fondamentale, il desiderio di imparare, di insegnare e far bene, è una gioia fantastica. E poi a Stefano, mio grandissimo amico, persona che ha fatto la presentazione alla traduzione del mio primo libro in italiano, quindi vediamo quanto vecchio è sempre una gioia vedere quel ragazzino. Okay, now I shift to English because I'm supposed to talk in English. My talk today is one of a series of talks that I'm giving, talks, essays that I'm working on the future of law and economics. And it begins with a distinction, which some of you who heard me talk yesterday have already heard me mention, between law and economics and economic analysis of law. Because economic analysis of law takes economics and looks at law from the standpoint of an economic theory and then criticizes it, confirms it perhaps, but decides what law ought to be on the basis of that economic theory. That is useful, that is important, but it is very limited because it takes an economic theory as a given. In a way, it treats economics as a queen of the sciences and law as her handmaid. Law and economics, instead, is a two-way street. In law and economics, the lawyer, as institutionalist, looks at the world as it is, says this is what is going on, and then asks whether economic theory can explain what the world is. At that point, if economic theory as it is does not explain it, law and economics does not say what economic analysis of law usually says: the world is irrational, the world makes no sense. An odd thing to say the world makes no sense, especially for economics, which proposes not to have any values of its own. to say the values of the world make no sense. Law in economics says, let us see whether we can modify economic theory, make it more nuanced, more complex, and see whether then it can explain what is happening in the real world. And in that way, it not only helps us understand what is going on in the world in that particular instance, but expands economic theory so it can treat other issues in a more complete and complex fashion. Now, I want to say that while people tend to think of economic analysis of law as being Richard Posner applying Chicago School Viennese economics to law and seeing how it shapes up, there's nothing in economic analysis of law requires it to be a Chicago school. You can have economic analysis of law in which your economics are Marxist economics, and you take them and you apply them to law and you say it's irrational. Or they can be the kind of work that, say, the Yale economists, Hansman, Rose Ackerman, Ayers, and so on, do, and apply that. Some may be a better economic theory than the other, but they all suffer from the same limitation that they take economics as a given and then try to see the world, shape the world in its form. Law in economics is that works both ways. There's nothing that new about this difference which I'm saying. 30 years ago, the syllabus of welfare economics at Cambridge University had in it, I don't even know who wrote it, a nice little note which said the difference between Richard Posner and Guido Calabresi is that Richard Posner takes economics as a given and applies it to law. Guido Calabresi takes law and changes economics, takes economics and changes law. But it's much deeper that way than that. It goes back to the 19th century at least, and to Bentham and to Mill. Mill described Bentham as one of the seminal minds of the century. Beyond what interestingly enough is the poet Coleridge. And then he said of Bentham, he approached all ideas as a stranger, and if these did not fit his theory, utilitarianism, he dismissed them as vague generalities, nonsense on stilts, irrational. Typical economic analysis of law. Mill said, but what he didn't realize was that in those vague generalities lay the whole unanalyzed wisdom and experience of the human race. Mill was the lawyer economist who said, look at the world and then check the theory. That doesn't mean that law is the answer or the world is the answer. The world may be exploitation, maybe ideas that are no good any longer. It's a two-way street. You go back and forth, as Mill well knows. Okay, that's what I am trying to do in general, and I will do that. I'm doing it in a variety of issues, of which only one of which I will be talking about today. I will look in different essays on the existence of altruism, beneficence, not-for-profit institutions, which economic analysis, economics today, does not explain. It does not explain how many there are, why the compañías al paro, why all of these things are there. And yet, if you look at it from a law point of view, you can change economics to explain that extraordinarily well. I will look at why we make distributional decisions in particular allocation situations. When Torts law says liability here rather than there, we take into account the wealth of the categories. That's what the world shows us. Economic theory, Kaplow, Chabelle, and so on, say you first decide what is the optimal wealth distribution, and then everything else must be done in straight efficiency terms. That isn't the way the world works, and I will try in another essay to explain it. In the third, and perhaps most important, I will talk about value shaping and what economics, if it is moved somewhat and still true to what it can do, can tell us about value shaping and what values give us the largest joint maximization of things that we want. Something that no one has spoken about. Today, I want to talk about another one of these, although all of them really deal with much the same thing and will ultimately come out with the importance of economics modifying its focus from pure markets and pure command to modified markets, modified commands, more complicated ways of allocating, granting incentives, and so on. Today I want to talk about merit goods. Merit goods. Now, the term merit goods originally came from Musgrave and Jim Tobin, my teacher, who said there are some goods that we call merit that society seems to allocate in ways different from most goods, and then didn't say anything much more. It said they are goods where the allocation causes external costs. The problem with that statement, classic economic statement, is that every good allocated in some way causes external costs. And we know since Ronald Coase that both command and markets try to internalize external costs of the other when it is cheaper to do it that way. So what is it that makes some goods different, and different in virtually all societies? What kinds of goods? Goods that sometimes we allocate in the common, sometimes we don't. Goods like body parts. Who gets to have the transplant? Goods like having children. Goods like, or bads, like being made to serve in military service. Goods even like political contributions, where somehow we are uncomfortable with the usual allocation. It seems to me that these goods fall into two categories. One category is those goods or bads where we suffer, we do not want them to be priced. The very fact of pricing something, commodifying them, is something which hurts us, costs us. In the rubric, always inelegant of the economist, diminishes our utility. Goods where the very fact of pricing is too costly. But, as I was saying in a moment, they are also often goods where the fact of deciding them by too clear command is costly. Where the decision, you get it and you don't, if made too clear, hurts us. So we have goods which are subject to commodification and what I will call, trying to be as inelegant as the economist, commandification. Okay. But there are also another set of goods, which I'll talk more about today, where it is not the price that is troubling to us. It is that we do not want these goods to be allocated according to the dominant wealth distribution. We don't mind pricing them. We don't mind putting the price on them, but we don't want that price then to result in these goods and bads being allocated according to the general wealth distribution, which for other reasons we have decided is the one that we want to have. We don't want education, perhaps, or body parts, or children, or military service, or political contribution to be affected directly by the market, where the market is the market determined by the amount of money which the general wealth distribution gives to one as against another. But here again, it isn't only that we don't want them allocated necessarily according to the generalized wealth distribution. We may also not want them allocated according to the generalized distribution of power. Because power is also not allocated in a way, it may be the best allocation for certain reasons of power. And yet there are some things that we don't want to have allocated simply according to who is more powerful, who is politically more important. So these are goods where we suffer when they are allocated according to the dominant market or according to the dominant power. Now let me say something about suffering. What that means is that the external cost is a very particular one. There is an external cost to me and to most people in the society, which is why we don't allocate it in that way, when these goods are either commodified, commodified, priced, or when they are allocated according to the dominant wealth. Traditional economic theory does not take this externality into consideration. It has traditionally ignored this externality. It has acted as if the fact that I don't like life to be priced shouldn't be considered. That I don't like the fact that life is assigned according to the dominant wealth distribution. That is something that traditional economic theory ignores. That's very strange, because that is a value judgment on the part of economic theory, and there is no more reason for that value judgment than any other value judgment which economic theory traditionally denies that it has. The fact that I don't like a price being put on life is as real, as significant to efficiency, to the economic structure, as the fact that I prefer caviar to potatoes. The economist is perfectly willing to say, of course, caviar costs more, but if you like it, de gustus non disputandum est. And the same thing with champagne rather than water, or, I want to say, as sex as a way of reproducing rather than using bull farms. It's much more efficient to use semen farms, but we don't do it that way because it's more fun to make love. It is the same thing with this. We want these goods to be allocated in a way that doesn't price them, because we want them to be priceless. We want these goods to be allocated in a way that is more common than the wealth distribution, because we want them that way. And economists have no more right, if they are true to their own theory, if I am true to that theory as an economist, to ignore these, than they do the desire for champagne or not. So that's a modification. Now what happens that we look at these things. Okay. Now, the problem with commodification. Oh, first let me say, there are some of these goods which partake of both. That is, where the cost to me is both the putting a price on them and the allocation of them according to wealth distribution. Some are all of one, some are all of the other, some are both. Now, it is easy enough to see those goods that we don't want to have priced, and yet where we would like in some way to take into account individual desire in the way a market system allows us to do. The greatness of a market system is it allows Rodotà to say, I like bananas, and Mattei to say, I like pumpkins. In things much more important than bananas and pumpkins. And we want to take that into account with respect to life, with respect to children, with respect to all sorts of things. And yet we don't want to put a clear price on them because we want price, certain things, to be pearls beyond price. Now, one way out of it would seem to be get away from the market and allocate these by command. Then we don't price them. The trouble is that it is also costly to say too clearly as to these goods, you, Rodotà, will have children, you, Mattei, will not. You, Rodotà, will live, you, Mattei, will not. When we commandify too clearly, we do something which is as bad as when we say, your life is worth 800, let's see whether people buy it. And let me give you an example, which I like to use. When the Pentagon Papers was being argued before the Supreme Court, you remember, this was a publication, the question of whether there could be published certain things about the Vietnam War. And Potter Stewart, a justice of the Supreme Court, graduate of my school and a good friend, leaned forward from the bench and asked Alexander Bickel, who was arguing the case, a colleague of mine, said, suppose it were the case that publication would result in the certain death of 100 young men and women. Wouldn't our allowing publication be a judicial sentencing to death of 100 young men and women? Bickel started to answer that as a professor, and then stopped, remembering he was really a lawyer in this case before the court, and said, that isn't this case, Justice Stewart, don't worry about it. And that's what Stewart didn't worry about. Justice Black, for whom I had learned, whose last opinion was he was dying, but this was a great case and he wrote something, told his clerk that the question was exactly the right one, but that the answer that was given was the wrong one. The problem was the judicial sentencing to death of 100 young men and women. He said, we waste, the parlance of the time, 100 lives. All the time. People die all the time for things that are far less important than freedom of the press. What is impossible is if the highest court in the land says, you will die for this. It's a commandification that was unacceptable. His solution, whether it's an acceptable one or not, was to say, you forbid prior restraint, you allow a publication all the time, the lives are lost before any decision is made by any court. Life is that way, people live, people die. There is no commandification. Notice that what he was doing was the same thing as somebody who says, do not price lives, do not price children, but try to find a market way without pricing that tells us how much people want for safety or not. Very difficult. When I was very young, I wrote an article called The Decision for Accidents, provocative title, intentional, in which I said, as a practical matter, we decide that a certain number of accidents are worth having, that it isn't worthwhile spending so much to avoid accidents. And I was saying, notice that in London and Heathrow, they have all sorts of anti-fog equipment because it is worthwhile for planes landing. In Arizona, they don't have it. It doesn't mean that sometimes it wouldn't be handy in Arizona. The New York Times wrote an editorial thundering and saying, when safety is at stake, no amount of money is too much. I almost wrote a letter and said, I'm glad to hear it. I think it will mean that all the New York Times delivery trucks will go no faster than 5 miles an hour. I didn't write it because I understood that the New York Times was saying something of value. They were saying, we don't want a price on it, even though we are actually creating things on it. But so it is with commodification. Okay, some merit goods are of this sort. I am more interested, though, today in those merit goods where we don't mind the price, where we don't mind the commodification, where we don't mind commodification, but we don't like these goods to be allocated according to the prevailing wealth distribution. What kinds of goods are they? Let's think about some that might be that way. Military service in wartime, if it is entirely volunteer, is troublesome to us because only the poor go to war. But a draft system which takes everybody has problems because there are some people who are more willing to go into this war because they believe in it, and others who don't. There's much individual choice, like Mattei, Rototara, bananas, and pumpkins. The problem is that if we have military service according to the dominant wealth distribution, only the poor will go, and that is properly offensive to us. We don't like it. It's an external cost. If we could have a system, a market, which put a price on them, but which was a different wealth distribution, we might not mind at all. If, for the head of a Intesa San Paolo, I'm not going to say the compagnie, staying out of the military required a payment of €1 million, while for the miserable Mattei, no, it requires only 100. So that approximately the same percentage of people, from the wealthiest to the poorest, would go into the military. We might not mind pricing that. It's not the commodification, it's the pricing according to the wealth distribution that troubles us. That same thing is true of many so-called merit goods. Think about others. It's not that we don't think that contributions to politics through money, not that we think that they are bad. I think the conservatives in the United States are correct in saying that there is a First Amendment right to speak politically through money. The problem is that Mr. Koch or Mr. Gates can have this much desire and speak at a $50 million and have an enormous effect. And the miserable Mattei, who cares passionately can only spend 100 euros. It's that doesn't measure the desire because it is based on the wealth distribution. And this is something very old. We find it in the gospel. When Christ says, the rich man who put the gold coin gave less than the widow because he gave out of his excess. She gave out of her need. The gospel is saying exactly the same thing. How many of these are there? You might test yourself. How would you feel about markets in transplants if they were wealth distribution neutral? We might very well say, all right, as to kidneys, as to hair, which I clearly would be in the market for, as to bone marrow, as to blood, but maybe not as to certain things which are too much of a personality, like semen or ova. No, we might then say there are some things we don't want to come on the flood. There are other things we are willing to have, so long as the underlying allocation is not combined with the general. Well, then why don't we change the general allocation and make it fairer? The reason is obvious. Some amount of wealth distribution differences, evidently, if you look at the real world, are wanted because they create incentives. They create incentives for people to do things. So we are willing, indeed, we accept a wealth distribution, which from some points of view is the best we can do with, because it causes people to do all sorts of things, build companies, invent things, and do things. But we don't want everything then to be allocated according to it. And that's the nature of the second category of benefit. Now, you know, this sounds so odd. It's not odd at all. We actually have done exactly this kind of thing in certain circumstances. During the war, World War II, during rationing, we set up a price system in which everybody got the same number of coupons and then could use them and decide whether they wanted cauliflowers or bananas. As to certain things, we set up a wealth distribution market. Other things we allow to go on the regular market. But if you start thinking that way, it becomes yet more complicated. We can allocate these things according to markets that are more complicated. We can have markets in time in which, instead of having the allocation depend on the wealth distribution, it depends on how much time you're willing to spend. Now, don't misunderstand me. Time is also not equally distributed. Mattei, God willing, has much more time at the age of 49 than Calabresi at the age of 78. Time, I think, is more valuable for me. I have much to do before I sleep. But it is a different allocation from the allocation of wealth generally. The moment the economist is made to think of allocations in ways that are not just the simple market way, any number of these problems can be helped, solved, mitigated. Now, one way of dealing with all this, of course, is to say, let's allocate this by command. Everybody has an equal amount. That's the draft. Everybody gets paid for military service. The problem with that is twofold. The first problem with that is that different people may have different desires. We may not want everybody to be able to speak politically with the same intensity because some people care more than others. We may not want everybody to have the same number of children. Some people may wish to adopt children and not have many of their own. Others may wish instead to have a great number of children and don't care about any of the other things in the world. Somebody may want to give virtually everything away to get a transplant that will allow him or her to live a year longer so that he can complete the great work on the future of law and economics. Somebody else may prefer instead to enjoy that year, or less than that year, and not give anything away. By doing it by command, we don't take into account differences. But also, by doing it by command, if we don't do it equally, but say, let a board or a government decide, we allocate according to the differences in power. And just as wealth is not equally distributed, so power is not. And again, for good reason. We have reason why we want some people to be more powerful than others. But that doesn't mean we want everything allocated accordingly. So, what do we do? If we start thinking this way about each of these, we can start thinking about what is the best way of allocating each of these goods, which in fact in a society are merit goods. We can start saying which ones we want to have allocated according to a wealth distribution neutral market, which taxes the rich more and subsidizes the poor, so that the goods are allocated in another way. Which do we want to have allocated according to a distribution of power? Which of these are goods where our problem is with the wealth distribution, the power distribution? Which of these are goods where the problem is the commodification and the commodification? We now have a more complex theory, and it can be true to economics. There is nothing that I have said that violates the rigors of economic theory. It just makes it more complicated in the same way that Ronald Coase, when he said, if markets were costless, there would be no firms, but there are firms, so why should economics continue to act as if markets are costless, and from which derive an enormous amount of very good scholarship. That is what we need to do here. We've got to decide which is which and which we want for what. And here I would say that there are a couple of problems. One problem is that if you look at any single good, even shoes, and that were the only good, you would probably say, we don't really want this allocated according to the prevailing wealth distribution. If that were the only good, we would probably not want it to be distributed that way. But if you do that, then you would make everything a merit good and destroy the prevailing wealth distribution. But if it is true that the prevailing distribution of wealth is there, because at some level we think there are incentive effects in it that are good, we have to decide which of goods there is a comparative advantage to allocating in a different way. Is education important enough? That is, do we suffer more if education is not allocated, is allocated according to wealth? Our body parts, military service, which ones can we pull from the dominant distribution of wealth and power and treat in a different way, while retaining enough difference in the general wealth distribution so that we can have both the incentive effects and this. That is why further study is needed, and that is why law and economics working together, come out with something which makes possibilities of reform, but of intelligent reform, of reforms which both looks at the real world and at theory, and together pushes us to doing something which make things better. So, like Dr. Balanzone, who always begins, I'm from Bologna after all, and goes all the way around and comes back to the beginning. What we need is a back and forth between law and the real world and economic theory, each criticizing the other, each allowing us to look at a series of things and not take those as a given, not say nonsense on stilts if they don't fit the theory, but look at the unanalyzed wisdom and experience of the human race and use it to make the theory better, more complicated, but remembering that in the unanalyzed wisdom of the human race, as Mill well knew, also lay years of exploitation, practices that are no longer worthwhile, which is why we analyze from the theory and look at it also from the theoretical point of view to get over it. If we do that, we can both make the world better, but also think of these things as you, youngsters at the IUC, as possibilities of study. I've talked in the most generic way. Think about which of these are best allocated through semi-markets, markets not in money, through semi-command, not command centralized, but command localized, through mixtures of command and markets. You are the ones who can do the studies. All I can do is suggest that the future in your hands looks very well.
Lectio Magistralis, giving us the opportunity to look at the importance of theory of goods for shaping relations with the people, with the outer world, with the other people, and the same distribution of power. So we have two comments to this very important speech. First speaker is Talia Sayed, is professor here in Berkeley, and beautiful.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Of course, it's an honor to comment on Judge and Professor Calabresi's top ready. Is that right? Okay. So, do you prefer Professor Calabresi or Judge Calabresi? Well, I'm not going to read over in public, so I'll have to do Professor Calabresi. So Professor Calabresi, discusses two types of merit goods that he distinguishes: those that can't be commodified or priced without doing some violence to the good itself, and those that are distributively troubling. And he provides an explanation of the two in terms of different kinds of external costs that each has: commodification and allocating according to wealth rather than distribution of some other sort. So what I want to basically do is, in fact, interrogate both of these examples. And I partly want to raise some questions about the explanation you provide about the reasons why we're uncomfortable with wealth allocation. I basically want to preface this by saying I agree that wealth allocation is problematic for all the goods you mentioned. I'm skeptical, though, of some of the reasons you're suggesting, and I think that skepticism is connected to my unease with some of the prescriptions, which seem to me to be too close to leaving everything as is, as unanalyzed wisdom, and not enough changing nonsense on stilts. So it's a common response to the imperialist economist Benthamite to retreat behind a kind of rich pluralism, which often, in fact, results in a kind of paralysis or complacent embrace of everything as it is. And so I want to push against that. I want to push against the idea that the way we muddle through today is a good way of dealing with the complicated tension between these goods and efficiency. So I want to just basically take one example of each. One is the commodification one, and let's talk about safety. So the idea here is, in tort law and the regulation of risk, all modern societies constantly and omnipresently make trade-offs between life and limb and economic convenience, driving speed, saving other sorts of costs. It's just an omnipresent reality that anyone who went to law school or is a grown-up must recognize. Now, Professor Calabresi correctly says we're uncomfortable simply directly saying, therefore we should basically say, a broken arm is worth $50,000, a life is worth $1 million, wherever the tables are. But what's the alternative here? The alternative seems to be to let the cost-benefit analysis be done behind doors by bureaucrats. Cass Sunstein right now is doing it for President Obama. He's running the cost-effectiveness state. He wants to implement cost-effectiveness, cost-benefit analysis. He wants to discipline risk regulation by adhering it to a basic price metric. Now, Professor Calabresi says the cost here is that we don't want these things to be transparent. And to some extent, we don't want to own up to doing them. That seems to be what you're saying. We like things to be opaque, and we like them to be done behind our back. We don't mind if 100 people are sacrificed. We don't just want to admit that we do it explicitly by judges. Now, I actually find both of these reasons completely unconvincing. It seems to me much better that we be transparent, explicit, and own up to our responsibility in making these trade-offs. I'd rather everyone realize that we make trade-offs and then figure out a way to make these trade-offs without relying on Sunstein's cost-benefit analysis, the economist price metrics, the Viscusi studies which look at how much workers value safety by looking at the risk premium of shitty jobs. I mean, you know, that's the economist way. Most people don't know it happens, but that's how it actually does happen. To me, there's no virtue in hiding that and shielding the citizenry from the fact that, in fact, this is how we do cost-benefit analysis. I actually would prefer what you call the external cost of recognizing that an omnipresent feature of modern life is the trade-off between life and limb and prosperity. And now we have to figure out, given that we don't want to do it the way the economists tell us to do it, and given that we don't buy the New York Times childish rhetoric of absolute safety and rights, what should we do? I prefer us to do it in this sort of deliberative, transparent way, rather than hiding what you're calling commandification or commodification, and in fact doing it either by judges deciding when 100 people get to be sacrificed, or the bureaucrats deciding how much lives and limb are worth. I actually disagree that the problem here is best dealt with by opacity. If you're right, and I believe you're right, that these goods shouldn't be allocated according to price, I don't think the reason is because we don't want to admit that that's what's happening. That seems to me a poor reason for saying we shouldn't allocate these things according to price. I don't think opacity and denial is the way to understand our problem with these goods. There's some other problem. I'm in fact trying to work on this as well. I think the problem is partly distributive and partly about aggregation. But in fact, I don't think it's about hiding from ourselves what we're doing and then doing everything the same way as it is before. So that's one example. The other one, if I have a couple of minutes. Okay, great. Okay. So the other one, the distributive case. So the distributive case, I also have some, I again, completely agree that these goods should not be allocated according to wealth efficiency. But it's interesting to try to think about exactly what the reason is for this. I don't think the reason is best explained as saying there's an external cost, which is some of us have preferences for different distributions, and therefore that should be factored in when we make the distribution of voting power or political speech or military sacrifice. I don't think that's just about a matter of preference, it's a matter of justice. I think, in fact, the distribution of social goods is a matter of justice, which we have to collectively deliberate about. And that means that we disagree with the economist, because the economist says, don't worry about distribution in the first instance, as you pointed out. Capital Chevelle say, listen, we all have different distributive preferences. What you do, first of all, is maximize wealth. You know, you give votes to whoever, you give political speech to whoever can pay for it the most. You make those go to the army who can be bribed to do that. And then if you don't like the people who actually get the most political speech, or people who have to go to the army because they are poor, well, don't worry, we'll do tax and transfer in the second round, and then after that, those poor people will be able to effectively pursue their preferences. Well, the reason we don't like this story partly is because we know that it's bullshit. That it won't be the case that if in time one you let people buy political speech, that in time two they'll allow themselves to be taxed. We just know that's implausible. We just know that we have to more directly affect the distribution, because if we just pursue wealth, it's not distribution neutral about the good. But I want to actually focus on the military case, because I'd love to hear your thoughts, because I find it really difficult. But these are the three possible scenarios, it seems to me. Commandification, according to you, is that we have a political decision of a compulsory draft. That's a commodification. Then let's say commodification is that we basically say everyone must serve unless you can pay your way out. So now we know the rich will buy their way out of the army. Then a muddling through hybrid is what we actually have. It's a volunteer army which people enlist upon receipt of various economic and educational benefits. And it so happens that the people in the US who enlist tend to be from socioeconomically disadvantaged groups. And so this mixed hybrid approach, which is I guess neither commandification nor commodification, to my mind is basically commodification. It's less unsavory than basically making everyone buy their way out of armed services, like they did in the Civil War. That seems to be unsavory to people. But I'm not convinced that shielding ourselves from the reality is worth it is in fact a justified response to the fact that we don't want military sacrifice to be distributed according to wealth. So that's basically, I guess, my sort of comments. Thanks.
Now.
Approach. This was my first encounter with the time semiotic analysis. Little did I realize at the beginning that this concept would heavily impact the way I think and the way I see the world. A semiotic analysis is a method of understanding the culture and value through which we make sense of the world as tissues of convention that have been handed down from generation to generation. It reminds us that nothing is natural, but rather the things through which we make sense of the world are merely a result of social constructs. It is this way that I have come to approach the concept of law, economics, and finance as taught here at the IUC. At the IUC, we are taught the disciplines of law, economics, and finance for an approach which allows us not to take these disciplines as being defined by precise rules, principles, and lessons, but rather as disciplines within which there are tremendous scope for self-expression in the form of interpretation and analysis. I have come to think of the law not as a neutral institution, but as an institution that is influenced by several factors, including politics, culture, and the market. Unlike Professor Calabresi, I do not see the law or lawyers as an institution which looks at the world as it is, but rather I see law as a language which can accommodate different values and therefore may project different images of the world, which does not necessarily reflect the reality. The law cannot claim to be the true image of the world for economics to follow. I think we have to move beyond the law and approach and see the reality of the world through an and approach like sociology and politics and economics, or race and gender and economics. It is the same method of thinking that I will apply to my discussion of Professor Calabresi's lecture on merit goods, the commons, and their significance for justice, efficiency, and equality. The concept of merit goods was first introduced in economics by Richard Musgrove in 1957. The merit goods was termed as a commodity to which individual or society should have on the basis of some concept of need, rather than the ability and willingness to pay. And have also come to be seen in terms of an extension of the idea of externalities. However, I believe that by attaching the economic language of good or commodity to merit, changes it from something that should be available to all into something that has economic value, which requires entitlement and therefore exclusion for some. In Professor Calabresi's view, the problem with certain merit goods is not the economic value that is given to it, but it is rather the way that these goods are allocated within the different distribution of wealth groups in society and the existing power structure. My question therefore is, how can we attain efficiency, equality, and justice for merit goods that have economic value or in the market? Does not efficiency in economy most of the time lead to entitlement by someone and others? Can the law positively impact the economy to address the issue of allocating the distribution of this merit good? And if so, will this create efficiency, equality, and justice in the distribution of merit goods? Can there be a perfect market for merit goods, wherein all things are equal? The concept of extending the market as the ideal institution for merit goods and the common creates an illusion of maximizing individual preference with a minimum of social coordination. Merit goods and the commons represent a series of social cooperation developed in a complex, heterogeneous society. The concept of market for merit goods or commons reflects Cox's theorem, which is often used to justify legal intervention, based on the idea that the law should bring about outcomes that will be achieved in the absence of transaction costs. Professor Calabresi, in the article Property Rules, Liability Rules, and Inalienability, One View of the Cathedral, advocates for the use of Cox's theorem of no transaction cost as a starting point of understanding the market, the same way that Say's law is used in macroeconomics, whilst at the same time acknowledging that in the real world there is no market with no transaction cost. However, David Kennedy sees engaging in cost-benefit analysis as a means of choosing what transaction costs to assume away, as taken for granted a certain distribution. According to Kennedy, if we assume away all transaction costs, then it costs nothing to reallocate goods so that even distribution cannot be taken for granted. Therefore, Kennedy concludes, cost-benefit analysis is indeterminate. It does not mandate a particular outcome, but simply a tool for the justification of political opinion without calling them political. Therefore, I do not believe that the market or economy should be extended to such area of society. Even if the type of market extended to merit or common good is not a pure monetary market, but one of exchange, it still carries with it consequences that affect its efficiency, equality, and justice, and maintains the distributional problem of power and wealth in society.
And now, Guido, we are waiting for your reactions.
So, first I want to talk about Professor Singh, because Professor Singh's comments were magnificent. They were almost a caricature of the academic. That is, what he said has truth to it, but has a certain amount of danger. Years ago, when I gave some lectures, became my book on tragic choices at the University of Pennsylvania, and I talked about how society used subterfuges, used fictions, legal fictions all over the place, because it thought that it could reach some results better through using fictions than by being too clear. A phalanx of academics came up to me and said, how can you say that we lie, that we use fictions? And my answer to that was then and still is now, because I am telling the truth. That is, if you look at the world, all sorts of things are hidden. I am not proposing that that is necessarily better. I am saying that we should take into account that things are hidden, are done in indirect ways, and we should ask why that might be. Now, it might be that that is a way of giving bureaucrats power. But it might also be but it is a way of not facing some things that we do not want to face. We want to say that there is an absolute against torture. And believe it! And I believe it! We want to say that life is a pearl beyond price. Because if we don't, if we do all these complicated studies and what people bid in this situation and how much of a risk they'll take in another, it becomes too easy for someone in power to say, with the best and the brightest, I know that it is all right to kill these people for this thing. Because we've given it the money, we have made it part of what normally we exchange without thinking more. Now, of course, when we hide, we incur a dramatic and awful cost, the cost of hiding. Truth, openness, is also a pearl beyond price. And academics are in the business of pushing for it. We are well paid, by and large, and well respected as we can, and then know that we can always try to do better. In that sense, let me say it quite directly, I am reflecting my own values. I am a radical reformer. I am a reformer. I want to make things better. Perfection is in another world, in another time. That's not for me. If I wait to do that which is perfect, I will do nothing. I think the scholar's role is drawn to that role, rather than either leave it as it is, or the revolution in some world that might never come, écraser la femme, let's just go to bed. But try to do better as we can.
Thank you, Guido, for these conclusions. And now the final words to Ugo Mattei.
Okay. Thank you so much. This was a very delightful morning, and it really made me proud of what we are doing here. It will be very short because after this interesting discussion, there is very little to add, except that I think that this discussion proves the fact that when we do basic research, is to say we go from the details of knowledge to try to understand the basics of how we arrange our affairs and how we arrange society, a lot of new ideas pop out from destroying the boundaries, from taking away the limits and the boundaries that separate knowledge, separate disciplines, separate areas of the world, separate domains. And so it seems to me that, you know, what we've seen here is how, in a way, the way in which we have been looking at things historically in our academic tradition today needs to yield to some new languages and to some new concepts. Languages produce and structure our world, that was certainly said, and it seems to me that in the last 30 years of transformations in law, in finance, in economics, we have been developing languages that have pushed incrementally to the right of the political spectrum our analysis. And today we need, to the point that both the political positions in the Western democracies are now going in a direction that is far away from those kind of ideals of justice that maybe we cannot reach in this world, but that we all have to struggle for. And in order to give strength to our struggles, we need new languages, new categories, new way of seeing things. And after a couple of years, 3 years actually, of researches that have been going on at the IUC, we started from the beginning conceiving Guido together as a community. It's a very open community of students, of scholars, of professors, based on a very sort of non-hierarchical, exchange-based position in order to learn from everybody without, outside of this idea that, you know, the Westerners teach and the non-Westerners listen, trying to learn from each other in a genuine way. So in the spirit of law and economics that you were trying to say between law and economics, but making it more kind of and, looking at stuff from very many perspectives, knowing that even the disciplines are something that have to be challenged, yet trying to be rigorous enough not to, you know, say a few words about the universe, which is the big tension in programs such as this. We thought that some promises were coming from the idea of the commons. And we thought that those promises were at least deserving to be explored in a variety of settings. And it seems to me that what you've been just saying about merit goods in a way shows that what we should call them are basically common goods. Are goods that we have not decided yet who they belong to, in the sense they belong to everybody. Are goods that should push away the logical concentration of power in favor of the diffusion of power. Are goods that should not be based on exclusion as property or statehood, but should be based on access. As Stefano was saying before, talking about the internet, that is clearly something that shows that access-based distribution is, at the same time, you know, the more enriching and powerful experience that we can share as a community. And we really tried to organize IUC in this perspective, even if it's difficult. And our perspective was basically to go beyond a logic, which is the logic of power, that has very much contaminated the academic world, especially in Europe, and, you know, in this country in particular, which is the distribution and allocation of knowledge based on power structures. Not substituting it with the distribution and allocation of knowledge based on, you know, competing star system, as too often, you know, the American system is becoming in these last 20 years. You know, so the position, what we admired, you know, as youngsters that went to America, that was this idea that, well, we're finally opening the windows away from this very hierarchical, power-based structure of university, in order to finally get there and to be recognized, you know, for what we say, for the merits, for the openness of the community and so on. But I've seen with my eyes, in the last 20 years, a lot of the American academic system becoming not so much based on that idea of openness, but rather on the idea of marketization, financiarization, commodification, in the sense of introducing ideas and concepts of competition between institutions, of competition between professors, of star system of a variety of kinds, that ended up producing lots of students that would get out of there, they're indebted to the point that they cannot exercise intellectual criticism anymore. And here at IUC, we really have seen how this is playing out globally. Because we are, among our applications, we are increasing every year the number of those that come from the US. They come after very interesting but very expensive education in the first, at the college level. And they want to have a break between a progress in knowledge that goes in the direction of a progress in indebtedness, and that at the end of the day doesn't allow them to be open enough to share ideas and, you know, to engage in lives that do not fit in the pre-packed position of, you know, of the successful academic or professional in the global world. And so we've been really trying to put things in this different way. We're exploring that. And of course, we know, you know, we are exceptionally indebted to you, because when we started this project and we really said, what can we do new? The value of your experience in running, you know, the most important law school in the world for many years has been very important to us, because we really wanted to do something new. We knew that we couldn't really compete with the American model of the same round. We had to experience something different, and our idea was, let's open the windows even more, but in opening the window, let's allow things to happen in the process of hybridization. So I'm so very, very happy that we're all here, we're still alive, and we have a future that hopefully is going to be bright from every perspective. Of course, I have to thank Guido, of course, I have to thank Stefano Da for the exceptional role he had for us being here. And it's really true, I must say. And this is not a metaphor, and it's not, you know. And so thanks a lot. For me, it's a great pleasure. And thanks to all the students. I declare this academic year.
Grazie a tutti.